Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Ukraine's future is our future, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said at the recent Coalition of the Willing gathering in London, underlining the stakes of a conflict now approaching its fourth year. While the US and European partners have imposed a fresh wave of sanctions on Russia and pledged continued military support back in Brussels, the EU struggled to translate pledges into concrete action. The disputes over €140 billion loan funded by frozen Russian assets exposed cracks in European unity, leaving questions over whether Kyiv will receive timely aid and whether Europe can maintain its promise as a partner. We're now joined by Richard Giragosian, founding director, Regional Studies Center, to explore all the latest developments. Thanks so much for joining us here on TVP World.
Thank you, Sascha.
I want to start with that quote and just the nature of it. I mean, it sounds well and good. Ukraine's future is our future, those words of the Prime Minister of the UK. But how realistic is that? What does it mean? What's that going to translate to into tangibles?
Well, of course, we do see a very uphill in terms of, as you've pointed out, the cracks within European unity. However, speaking from Armenia on the front line after this Russian aggression and failed invasion of Ukraine, I'm more positive. We've seen a flurry of activity this past week between the European Council meeting on Thursday and London's Coalition of the Willing on Friday. I do think the gains were more important than the frustrations. For example, the Trump administration rather welcome but surprising move to impose energy sanctions on two key Russian companies, Transneft and Lukoil. This makes the European effort much easier, especially given the credibility gap with the Trump administration over the past several years. Moreover, I do think this is yet another positive momentum of Western support and backing for Ukraine as the winter is coming. This is particularly a key question of timing.
Mm-hmm. Good. I mean, in terms of, you said there are gains, so there was a flurry of activity, but I will try and criticize it a little bit. I mean, one of the things, I mean, you're right, the sanctions, the 19th package passed through the European Union. That's a good thing, as well as, as you said, the surprising sanctions by the United States, by Donald Trump. But at the same time, one thing that was been holding out for such a long time was the Russian frozen assets, and they're held in Belgium. It looked very much until the last moment that Belgium was finally ready to say, okay, we can go into this. We can use this money, which is so critical, Belgium being very much a key ally, but that ended up being blocked ultimately. So again, this was seen as a disappointment. Do you disagree here? Do you think this is going to change? I mean, this has been a talking point for months and months on end.
Well, yes, you're quite right. And then now the issue of using Russian funding to provide leverage support for Ukraine has been deferred to Christmas at the earliest, best case scenario, which does little to reassure Kyiv. At the same time, we do see progress in two fronts: the continuation of weapons flows to the Ukrainian defense in spite of much of the unpredictability from Washington. Second, we see a new realistic assessment within the European Union in terms of defense readiness, taking new steps to counter airspace violations, but also in terms of addressing strategic dependencies on the U.S. And in this regard, I do think we can't have dangerously unrealistic expectations either. And one final example from the Coalition of the Willing. For the first time ever, the newly elected Japanese prime minister has actually joined this. In other words, what we see is support for Ukraine is growing, and the diplomatic isolation of Russia is actually expanding.
I mean, there's really a patchwork here at the moment. I mean, we have the coalition of the willing. That as well it has its potential, but it seems also kind of constrained a bit by national priorities as well. We have the European Union as well. We have other NATO countries. So is this whole patchwork of different organizations? Then we have certain times bilateral countries doing a lot. If we look at what Poland has done or what the UK is doing, in a way, looking forward to all this, is there a way that this can combine in one element? Is this sort of hamstringing a little bit what Ukraine needs? At the same time, there have been no new long-range missiles, for instance, delivered, which is certainly something that these countries can do, but that's still not happening. So is this patchwork ultimately good? Is there too much? Are there too many chefs in the kitchen, as you say?
Well, good question, Sascha. The short answer is, realistically, it's the best we could hope for. The longer answer, however, is what we see is to the credit of Russian President Putin. The Russian president deserves credit for succeeding in two areas. Russia has united the West in a very significant way. And second, Russia has succeeded in losing partners and making enemies. In other words, a lot of this Western unity commitment to Ukraine is also a reaction to Russia's rather arrogant miscalculation. However, having said that, you're quite right. For example, the coalition of the willing meeting in London was very much about the UK finding its footing after Brexit in terms of European security. We also see the French, the Belgians, and the Germans much more following their national agendas than perhaps pursuing a more collective approach. But I do think in hindsight, it's probably the best we could hope for under the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Okay, speaking of hope, I mean, one thing that did surprise to the benefit of Ukraine, and I think also the West, is exactly that. Donald Trump's decision to finally slap on those serious sanctions had been kind of floating around for a while. Was he going to do it? Was he not going to do it? And there he goes. So in terms of then now policy for anything else, does this now, at least carefully in your mind, does this now pivot Donald Trump more into the mindset of listening more to those European allies? I mean, they've been meeting him, they've been going to the White House, they've been channeling a flurry of a lot of shuttle diplomacy. Is he now moving more into the understanding that tougher things are required with Russia?
That's a question with no clear answer. In other words, the Trump administration is most defined by its unpredictability. And unfortunately, I simply don't know. Having said that, what we do see is the Trump administration moving away from its tendency to accommodate Russia and placate Putin, and more to a realistic and much needed hard line. And this reflects President Trump's personal frustration with his Russian counterpart. For the Ukrainians and for the NATO alliance, however, it's much less about counting on the Americans and more about forging a European approach to reinforcing security. I think the coming test will also be on the escalation of airspace violations of EU member states and a more aggressive Russian posture militarily.
Mm-hmm. Also, speaking of more aggressive posturing, and we've recently heard that there have been more tests, also serious firepower that the Russians have been showing off these last few days. What do we read into that? I mean, this is of course Putin talking to the West, talking to the United States. How do we interpret that, and what should our response be?
Well, I think militarily, more than diplomatically or politically. Militarily, we have witnessed a Russia that is in a position of weakness, not strength, of insecurity, not confidence. And much to the surprise of many military analysts, the incompetence of the Russian armed forces was the big surprise here. Now, even militarily, Russia is increasingly dependent on China in terms of waging this war. And I think from a military point of view, this is an act of desperation by Russia rather than a coherent military campaign strategy.
But on that point, it's interesting because, I mean, we've heard this as well from other NATO leaders, different countries in Europe, the European Union saying that Russia is running out of ammunition, it's low on troops, it's low on ideas, it seems to be losing. So why not exploit that more aggressively? I mean, if this really is the case, why are European allies, why is the United States not doing more and maybe providing some of that key material that Ukraine needs?
I think the real concern is the understanding that Russia has now put itself in a corner, and it is actually seeing any sign of compromise as a sign of weakness. Therefore, the European and Western commitment to European security is based on a need or necessity for de-escalation. I do think the real danger here is the EU and the US will seek a face-saving deal that tends to threaten to compromise Ukrainian security. At the same time, what we also see, however, is Russia has no way out, no exit strategy, which makes them more dangerous and more unpredictable.
All right, and there's going to be a lot of pressure now on the Kremlin, I think more than we've seen. And we've heard Donald Trump say that he doesn't want to actually even meet Vladimir Putin unless he's guaranteed that there can be something signed, something tangible. What do you make of that statement? He just made it recently that he's shelved that meeting in Budapest. That's not happening. Is this now Trump angling for something? Does this mean we're closer to something? How do you interpret the president's word? I know it's fickle and mercurial, but nevertheless, it does seem to stand on sure footing that he's just pushed off the meeting.
Well, given President Trump's long superficial statements, well short of a thought-out policy, I think the Americans see this as yet another real estate deal. And unfortunately, the unpredictable nature of the Trump administration only complicates European efforts. Having said that, I do think Russia has been doing a good job at angering Washington. And in this context, Budapest was a missed opportunity not just for the Hungarian leadership to garner legitimacy, but a missed opportunity for the Russians. And I do think President Trump, no matter his inclinations to accommodate Russia, will be pressured and forced to adopt and maintain a harder policy.
Also, you mentioned earlier, I mean, this is something happening right now. Donald Trump is on his way. He's actually in Asia at the moment. One of those key meetings will be with also Chinese President Xi Jinping. I mean, China is obviously a key player. Donald Trump wants a win. How do you think he's going to be speaking with Xi Jinping? Is there some kind of, let's say, breakthrough here with China removing its support of Russia in any way?
Well, the challenge in this text is U.S.-Chinese relations currently are dominated by everything but Ukraine. It's more about trade tariffs, it's more about telecommunications and AI, and much less about Chinese support for Russia. I think it's far too down the list of priorities for the Americans. One thing is clear, however, there's only one winner from Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. And it's increasingly looking like China as the strategic winner. And in this context, I do think the U.S. is focused much more on the over-the-horizon threat from China coming in the future, and much less about the current present challenge from Russia.
Okay. And then also moving it back to Europe, I mean, if we combine this coalition of the willing meeting, we had the European Council, so all the European leaders meeting there together. What's your final takeaway? Just like a few moments now, the final answer of what the takeaways from this week and then what we can expect in the future.
I think there's a welcome recognition in Brussels of the need to be on the same page. In other words, much less tolerant of Hungary or other member states drifting away or adopting opposing policies, and much more a commitment to a collective backing for Ukraine.
All right, so there's still more work ahead, but as you said, they're encouraging surprising signs that we've seen this week, so let's hope that momentum continues. Look, it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much there, Richard Giragosian. Thank you for all those insights today.
Thank you, Sascha.
And thank you for watching World Talks, but as ever, there's more right here on TVP World, so don't go away.